Synanon is difficult to explain because almost every facet of it sounds like an entirely different organization. One moment it resembles a genuinely revolutionary rehab movement. The other, it feels like an experimental commune full of celebrities, motorcycles, encounter therapy, and California optimism. And then suddenly you're reading about shaved heads, communal child rearing, forced sterilization, and armed security patrols. The strangest part is that these two are not separate movements. It was all the same movement with the same people and the same leader. Welcome to Gallows Humor. My name is Gallows Humor, and today we're talking about Synanon. In the 1950s, heroin addicts were viewed as basically unrecoverable.
He's experiencing withdrawal symptoms.
And if he can get his narcotic,
He lives from fix to fix. And if he is lucky, he dies early. Maybe from an overdose. Maybe from an infected needle.
There was almost no rehabilitation infrastructure in the US yet, and residential treatment programs barely existed. Most organizations approached addiction like either a crime or a moral failure. And then somehow, a former alcoholic with a giant ego and a talent for yelling at people created one of the most influential recovery movements in American history. His name was Chuck Dederich. Chuck was a recovering alcoholic who had completely wrecked major portions of his life through drinking. He attended Alcoholics Anonymous, but eventually decided AA wasn't enough for him. His daughter later described him as not really being the kind of person who wanted to quietly work the 12 steps forever. He wanted a program that went deeper, a program that forced people to be fully honest with themselves for perhaps the first time in their lives. Way down the road, this creates a disaster, but in the beginning, Chuck genuinely seemed like he wanted to help people. So he started a small group, and they were based out of a storefront in California, like a strip mall, actually. To be part of Synanon at the time, the rules were incredibly simple. There was no drugs, no violence, and you had to play the game.
Hello, Amanda. I want to play a game.
And that was basically it. So no methadone, no doctors, just withdrawal and recovery through the game. The game was based on Chuck's belief that addiction thrived in secrecy, manipulation, and self-depreciation. So the game was a brutal form of group confrontation where members verbally tore into one another for hours at a time. The idea was addicts were often extremely good at lying to themselves. But inside the game, everybody in the room already knew every excuse, every manipulation tactic, and every performance by heart. They've already done those things. You can't manipulate the manipulator. People described it as part therapy session, part verbal street fight. And somehow for a while, it actually worked. And perhaps more importantly, people loved it. Like, really loved it. Some people played the game 3 or 4 times a week. Some participants said it forced them to confront truth about themselves for the first times in their lives. Others said they would lie awake afterwards, replaying everything in their minds over and over again. Which means the game wasn't just emotional release. It was psychological immersion. You were constantly processing the group, reevaluating yourself, and being emotionally exposed. And for recovering addicts, many of whom had spent years isolated, dishonest, and emotionally detached, that kind of forced honesty could feel revolutionary. It felt freeing. Chuck believed addiction came from emotional dishonesty and internal dysfunction. The game was supposed to expose all of that publicly and allow others to call you out on it. And the stranger part is that this process was working. It seemed to help a lot of people. Addicts got sober and they stayed clean. That's the biggest part, is they stayed clean. Synanon gave them jobs, structure, and purpose. And perhaps most importantly, they found community. And that word, community, becomes the entire key to understanding what Synanon is and what it will become. People don't join groups like Synanon because they're stupid. They join groups like this because they're disconnected. They're isolated and they're lonely. For many residents, it was the first time they had ever felt genuinely wanted. There were people there who actually gave a shit if you lived or died, and they were there to help you through withdrawal. By 1961, Synanon had grown so large that it moved into a massive armory in Santa Monica, California. This is where the story becomes a little aggressively Californian. Outside the armory, there was the Beach Boys, sunshine, and free love. But inside the walls of the armory, you had recovering addicts chain-smoking cigarettes while verbally destroying one another. It's like Thanksgiving at my family's house. Okay, sorry, back to the video. But that didn't matter because Synanon was working. And in the beginning, I think the place sounded kind of amazing. Nobody went hungry and everybody worked. People supported each other and there was a shared vision of recovery, right? Everyone was there for a reason. We had a shared purpose. Chuck realized early that if Synanon became economically self-sustaining, residents could live there for free. An early member of Synanon boasted, drug addicts are the best con artists, and they use that skill to its full capacity. Donations started pouring in. People were donating buildings, whole businesses, straight cash, and even livestock. Synanon bought gas stations and businesses, so the money just flowed in constantly. And because Synanon was a non-profit organization, it received major tax advantages. They were tax exempt via 501 3C. I don't know. At this point, though, the local community absolutely hated Synanon. Santa Monica residents did not want hundreds of recovering addicts living nearby. You know, it goes back to not in my backyard politics. Everybody really wants to help prisoners and addicts, but they don't want it to happen where they live. The people protested, and they treated it like it was a threat to the entire town. Some people even created like hanging Synanon puppets, and they pretended to hang them in front of the organization. It was kind of like threatening, actually. And as tensions continued to rise, Chuck, the founder of Synanon, was actually arrested over zoning violations. Officials were trying to classify Synanon as an unlicensed hospital. If they classify it that way, they would shut it down. Outside hostility made Synanon stronger internally. Synanon now had enemies, persecution, and a sense of collective struggle. And that is the exact psychological environment where cult dynamics begin forming. Within Synanon, the message increasingly became, if you leave, you'll relapse. If you leave, you'll die. I want to be clear here, though, for many addicts, that probably didn't feel manipulative at all. It probably felt true. Where they were was safe and structured. They were allowed to be themselves, and outside of there, left to their own devices, they often returned to drugs. And that is why Synanon became so powerful. It built on genuine emotional needs. At this stage, Chuck Dederich also still had someone balancing him emotionally. His wife, Betty. Betty is incredibly important to the story and honestly gets overshadowed sometimes because Chuck is such a massive personality. But according to former members, Chuck was the hammer and Betty was the kiss. That dynamic was required for Synanon's success. Chuck was intense and aggressive. He was often confrontational but charismatic, and Betty softened the whole environment. If Chuck went too hard on someone during a session of the game, Betty would check on them afterwards or even take them out to lunch just to make sure they were okay and handling Chuck's words in the best way possible. She grounded the atmosphere emotionally and made the place feel human. Something Chuck kind of lacked. They're basically the mom and dad of Synanon. And that emotional display, I believe, helped people trust Synanon far more deeply than otherwise they probably would have. By the mid-1960s, Synanon was exploding. Culturally, though. Celebrities started visiting, and even President Nixon, he praised the organization publicly. And we all know he's a great guy.
Sock it to me?
But then something fundamental about Synanon started to change. And that's when non-addicts started joining Synanon. These people became known as lifestylers, right? They weren't there for treatment. They were there for the lifestyle. They were educated, professional, middle-class Americans, but people joined because they too craved emotional honesty. They craved community and meaning. And some people literally just joined because they wanted to play the game. That was a very important turning point because now Synanon stopped being a rehabilitation program and started becoming more of a social movement. It reflected the broader culture perfectly, though. This was the era of civil rights movements, anti-war activism, communes, psychedelic experimentation, radical psychology, and social reinvention, right? It's free love, baby. Synanon fit right into that world. It was a mix of all of that. It was racially integrated. Men and women lived communally. People shared money, work, and responsibilities. And Chuck referred to everything as an experiment, right? That meant things can change. We're always adapting to what's happening. At one point, Synanon even opened schools built around some experimental educational theories. Children dictated what they wanted to learn, and there was no strict curriculum. I believe they called it self-learning or self-teaching. And as you can see, this is where the story starts to get a little strange, because then they introduced the children to the game, actual children, how to play the game. Imagine being in middle school, except instead of playing dodgeball, you're participating in this aggressive confrontation therapy with other 8-year-olds. Some kids could not handle it, and a lot of them actually shut down. There's one clip that I saw that showed during one of the sessions of the game, there was a child who was plugging his ears with his fingers. He just couldn't handle the psychological unload onto him from his classmates. You know, and while this was happening, Synanon was still expanding rapidly. Members donated almost all of their income, so millions and millions of dollars flowed into the organization. Businesses like AdGap exploded, which was a subsidiary of Synanon. They were one of the first companies to make like corporate pens and shit. So like, oh, put Apple's name on this fucking shoe. They're like, no problem. They were the company that would print that stuff. That's AdGap. However, with this explosion of wealth, right, it created internal tension. The OGs, right, the people who had been at Synanon since the beginning, were kind of being pushed aside by newer lifestylers. But the original addicts knew Chuck before Chuck became Synanon Chuck, before the empire and before people started treating him like a prophet. The lifestylers, meanwhile, increasingly viewed him as a visionary, trying to change humanity itself. By the late 1960s, Synanon had evolved into something much bigger than addiction recovery. Chuck began dreaming about building an entire self-sustaining city. Communal compounds expanded into places like Tamales Bay, which is also in California. And this is where one of the most disturbing elements of the story quietly begins. Because once people live, work, and marry only within a specific group of people, the outside world and that reality starts to slowly fade away. And as this happens, Chuck starts becoming omnipotent. He created what he called the wire. which was a communication network via the radio that connected all Synanon facilities through the radio waves. They had little radios everywhere throughout all of their facilities so that no matter where you were, you could still hear Chuck talking, and you could tune into either a game session or you could listen to a seminar. But Chuck's voice became constant background noise during work, and school, and just everyday life. Even taking a shit, Chuck was talking about God knows what and being angry at somebody. So people listened to him constantly. Not because they necessarily wanted to, but just because he was constantly around. And because Chuck spoke and was recorded continuously, his thoughts transformed into Synanon policy in real time. So Chuck needed to quit smoking. No one could smoke. And when the smoking ban happened, hundreds of people actually left Synanon. This little rule change represents something much larger in the works. It shows the organization slowly transitioning from community focus to leader focus. Everything in Synanon increasingly reflected Chuck's personality. Chuck thought communal parenting sounded idealistic. He believed damaged addicts could collectively raise healthier children than traditional individual parents. But eventually that idea grew into babies being moved away from parents almost entirely into a centralized care system called the hatchery. At the hatchery, parents were allowed to visit their children, but they weren't allowed to give care. Women breastfed others' babies. Children lived communally, just like the adults. Caretakers rotated constantly. Chuck's idea was, we know a better way to raise your children. And that sentence alone should probably terrify the fuck out of everyone, right? The stories from these facilities become heartbreaking very quickly. One baby reportedly cried constantly and was isolated alone in a room. He would crawl to the door and stick his fingers underneath trying to get attention, while adults repeatedly moved him back to the center of the room. There was no comfort or affection. There was just emotional management. And increasingly, that became the emotional atmosphere at Synanon. Human beings were treated less like people and more like tools that needed to be optimized. By the early 1970s, the organization was openly experimenting with every aspect of human life: education, parenting, sex, and even marriage. Chuck Dederich increasingly sounded less like a recovery leader and more like someone trying to redesign humanity. That would become very important later, because eventually the experiment stopped being voluntary. And once that happens, Synanon begins transforming into something much darker. And that's where we'll pick back up next week for part 2 of Synanon. Thank you guys so much for joining me this week. I hope you've really enjoyed this story. It's massive and complex, and it just needed a part 2 because I need to give the story the full respect it deserves, you know. So let me know what you think in the comments. Have any of you ever heard of Synanon? Do you know anyone who's in Synanon? That would be cool. You know, let me know. But go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe. It means so much more to me than you know. It helps the channel out a lot, and it helps me and Hannah grow a lot. So, like I said, I can't wait to talk to you guys next week and wrap up the story. See you next week.